Okay, here we are, the first episode of Talking Tethix. I'm your co-host, Matthew Mitkar, one of the co-founders and the chief vision shaper of Tethix, and I have the wonderful uh, Alia
Alia
over
is Sakharich.
here. And in this episode, these shows, we've got themes that drive these shows. They're probably going to be tangential as conversations are. And today's episode is going to start talking about tech ethics is more than just a role or a title. And there's going to be lots of different topics that we'll cover as we work through this conversation in a casual fashion. And that'll be everything from talking about these types of titles: chief trust and safety officer, head of data ethics, and things like that we're starting to see emerge in the market, particularly over the past 2 years. And we'll be covering why it's more than just that title and a role, and what happens within an organization. How do we operationalize things like ethical decision making in modern product organizations that are creating technologies? We'll touch on maturity of the field. We'll look at the importance of risk. We'll look at the maturity in relation to other types of roles and fields, and kind of talk about ethics as a practice, and probably a whole bunch of other really interesting things, or hopefully interesting, probably interesting to us because we're talking about it. So starting off with this, I mean, what we're seeing in the market at the moment, Alia, and we've been in this space of responsible tech and innovation and ethics in technology for some time, and over the past 2 years, I think there's this is acceleration of people being brought into organizations, generally in senior leadership and management, where they're given the kind of title or the role to lead initiatives. And some of that might be ethics washing or trust washing in some way. It might be a PR exercise. It's like, on the surface, we have this person that is meant to be responsible for ethical decision making, or trust and safety within the organization. And that is that it's more than just a title. Uh, what is it? Why is it more than just a title, Walia? Maybe you can
Well,
shed some light on that.
yeah, I think what worries us, and we had these conversations, is that when you introduce a new role like this and you make somebody a person responsible for your all ethical dilemmas and problems, you run the risk of other people in the company just saying, okay, so that's not my problem anymore, I don't have to think about ethics. And what personally worries me is that we might be seeing a situation similar to the one we had in the field of diversity and inclusion, when all these big companies started hiring chief diversity and inclusion officers and all the fancy titles. But given their yearly diversity reports, we see that things didn't really change within the company. And we had the same companies who had previously problems with diversity, sexual abuse, all these problematic behaviors, hiring practices, and all of that. We had the same companies making the same mistakes, even though they had a diversity person hired. And what worries me, while it's great that we have roles like a tech ethicist, is that companies will not change their internal processes and change their practices and make ethics part of their day-to-day job, because that is the hard change. Hiring somebody to take care of ethics and be the chief tech ethics expert is relatively easy, although it is hard to find the right person for that. Of course, we're not trivializing that, but this is probably just the first step. And we are kind of curious, and what do you think, how should the companies move beyond just hiring for that role? What do you think?
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's interesting. Like the example with diversity and inclusion, and that's been, I guess, a more um, uh, probably a more mature theme than ethics and ethical decision making, at least in technology companies. Although business ethics and codes of ethics have been around, kind of leaning on corporate social responsibility, for the better part of 3 or 4 decades. But it doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to change. When you hire someone at the top, in a senior leadership position, that so much of this, particularly in large organizations, the transformation that's actually required, and when it comes to something like a role that's given to someone, that is, the chief person for um, uh, exercising value judgments and making these decisions, that's just not sufficient. And I don't think that a lot of these titles are just titles. I think there's a lot of organizations that are out there that are doing these things that are, the intent is there to take it seriously. Although there's probably counter examples to that where it's absolutely ethics washing and trust washing taking place. But no one person is responsible for these value judgments on features to develop, how data is going to actually be used, the importance of privacy, how do you include different stakeholders. um, uh, that's such a social process, and value judgments are not something that a single person can hold. um, yeah, and I mean, it's interesting when you look at the maturity of the field as well. Like, it's a relatively immature field as quite a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, intersectional domain compared to something like chief information security officers, and even security, privacy, cybersecurity practices within organizations. A lot of that's about translating to behavior. And that takes a whole bunch of time. I mean, I've seen very poor um, information security practices and operational security practices in large organizations that have quite mature programs, but because it is reliant on um, shifts in people's everyday behaviors, it takes some time now. Um, Information security, operational security is uh, not quite the same as ethics, though, right? If ethics is much more about making these um, decisions that are in alignment to your purpose as an organization, the values that you hold, that you stand for, and that you'll fight to defend, and the principles that you might have documented or not, that are there to guide your actions. So it's a little bit more. Um,
Yeah, it's hard to define. As I was
yeah.
listening to, it got me thinking, right? What you said earlier. With diversity, probably we often have clear goals defined, right? Companies say, so we want to, for example, increase the number of women in leadership roles or increase the number of people representing different minorities that we hire. While, and in terms of security as well, which is another great example and maybe field to compare, we also have relatively clear goals of what we're trying to achieve, prevent data leaks, make sure nobody is hacking us. We have a good practice of what is basically good security practices. So in ethics we have this problem that we probably don't often even have clear goals. Maybe things like accessibility, sustainability are two areas within the kind of responsible tech that are the most clearly defined. But yeah, when it comes to other fields, being ethical, acting responsibly, what does it even mean? So we're
Mm.
also lacking, clear metrics and what even is the, the goal, and how will, in essence, the success of a chief tech ethicist be measured. How
Mm.
do we know they're doing their job right? So what do you think? Will we need kind of clear metrics, or how do we define even metrics for ethics?
Yeah, that's a very good point around um, the indicators that you're using to measure progress, or what you're trying to achieve. Even with the example of diversity and inclusion, it might be like increasing the number of women that are at the board or across the organization, or neurodiverse people, or whatever it might be. And so you've got these kind of maybe quantitative indicators that are quite probably quite clear for a lot of people. Um, Information security, for instance, is also much clearer around reducing number of incidents, or making sure you pass your audits. So it
Exactly.
seems like it's a little bit more objective. Um, Whereas, yeah, someone that's put in this role of you know chief director of ethical and humane use, or whatever the title is that's related to these value judgments, um, it's a little bit more gray. It's more intersubjective.
Yeah.
The culture of the organization, the people that work there, the customers and end users, but also society in general. So it's a much more harder role for the people that are
Yeah.
given this role. But I guess the interesting part of this, like, you think, with a chief information security officer, a chief privacy officer in those kind of fields, um, you do have quite distinct practices that have been around for a long time. Privacy and security by design, privacy engineering. Um, so there is quite clear best practices to be following, and have mature privacy or cybersecurity programs. Um, so they've got their work cut out for them. But I guess, like, this idea that um, ethics is much more about uh, the decisions that we make when we're choosing to, that it might be proactively upfront in product development and research and development, or the discovery kind of phase, or reacting to things where something, an AI model was deployed, and some bias was overlooked or didn't get caught, and as a result, it's created some issues. So it might be some reactive decision making that needs to be addressed. And how does this kind of start getting down to uh, the everyday practices, like when it's not just about this title, and you might have the person as the um, chief of ethical and humane use. How does it translate into the everyday decisions of a cross-functional product team, your designers and your researchers and your engineers and your data scientists, and how does it influence their decision making? uh, and how does
Exactly.
that change?
Yeah, it feels like in this field we've been all very reactive in a sense. So we wait for something to go wrong. As consumers, we wait for companies to really fuck it up in a big way, uh, until we react, even, or as employees as well. And it's
Mm.
interesting what you were just mentioning, about everyday decisions. I recently saw a TikTok video from a tech worker who said, that she was answering questions at a school that, where she was talking about her role, and the students ask, how do you ensure that you're making ethical decisions? And she was saying, well, I don't feel like I have much power in what I do as a tech worker. And this is quite problematic, and especially when we don't actually have any good measurements or understanding what is ethical. It seems like we only know what is wrong when we really do something wrong and say, oh, we shouldn't have done that. So we should probably be thinking about how to maybe use more tools and have more discussions that are also more proactive, right? So we don't wait for something to go wrong, but include that as part of our everyday development, design, project management, whatever process. So whatever role you're in, it should be part of
Mm.
every role, essentially.
Yes, this idea that it's more than just than just the title. Like ethics is everyone's job.
Yeah.
And ethics is every day. We're making value judgments a lot, and we don't realize it. And these are risk relative or scale relative problems. Sometimes it's like, a small little decision that you might make around, like as a designer in a user interface around, the color of a button or something like that. It might be um, reasonably, small stakes at play as a result of doing that, and you might take away people's agency or something in a shopping cart system or, an onboarding flow or something like that. And, I think that those decisions are being made every day, but they're lower risk versus like this big, okay, we've got this new product that we're bringing to market, and it's using, a whole bunch of machine learning, and we've trained that data, and we've made sure there's limited amount of bias in it, but the risks of things going wrong are much higher when you've got something like that. So, how do you account for all of this? Because the designer making that decision, that's someone being cognizant and familiar with what to look for, how to design. It's very tactical, versus these bigger things are much more strategic.
Yeah.
You might get the reaction that comes as a result of something going wrong, which is what you were saying, which is very interesting. We don't always know what we should have done or what we should be doing until we do something that we realize we shouldn't have done.
Yeah, but
If that makes
also,
any sense.
you talk about small decisions, and I was reminded of the story of how Facebook ended up implementing the like button. That seemed like a very small decision at the time, right? And I'll try to remember the story correctly. We'll probably post links with more details and proper attribution to to the person who implemented that. But the core idea was simple, right? So at that time, you had Facebook feed, and people were posting updates. And I think it was one designer that had the idea. All right, so it takes a bit of effort, and when somebody posts like a happy news that they graduated or something, moved to a new house, people just post the same comment all over again, right? Congratulations, or something like that. And then a designer was thinking, well, what if we just, add a button to express kind of the support for what just happened? It seemed like a very simple decision. And, most of us, when making that decision, would go, yeah, sure, sounds great. But now, looking, of course, with the power of hindsight, we see that that kind of had a lot of consequences, because it introduced the idea of measuring kind of popularity, success, and people now get really upset if their posts don't have enough likes, and feel lonely or forgotten by their friends, and so on. So many consequences that actually the designer at that point, and I'm not blaming them, right? It was really hard to kind of anticipate things like that. So I wonder, how do you even know when a decision you're making, even if it's a color of a button, is a big one or a small one? It's probably easier when you're making kind of the obviously big strategic decisions to pause and have those conversations. But what about the small ones, right, that add up eventually? How do we
Yeah,
deal with those?
in aggregate, a lot
Yeah.
of these small decisions. Although that the like button, was it seems like such a small thing, but in terms of the functionality of like a social network that at that point had tens of millions of users, the implications of behavior change as a result. Um, in hindsight, it's easy for us to say, yeah, well, we see
Exactly.
what has happened, but how do you help people to develop the moral imagination to be able to actually understand and work through the moral implications, the value judgments, the consequences that might happen as a result of that? And if you come down to like a designer, designing an interface as an example, they're not going to stop in their workflow.
Yeah.
But incorporating, I guess, these feedback loops and working with stakeholders and involving like different audiences in your kind of user research that you do, you can start surfacing these things, but you can preempt them a lot as well. I think if you have quite proactive approaches and you're starting to operationalize a set of principles, be that in ethical design or AI ethics, you can start embedding this type of thinking, this type of perceiving in everyday decision making. And that behavior change takes a little bit of time. I got this, I guess, this term that gets used, ethical muscle memory, and this idea of embodied cognition. It's like you feel it, you understand it, you're able to recognize it and see it and perceive it just as a result that's a little bit more intuitive. And that actually takes training. It takes time for people to develop that muscle memory, similar to like dancing, or anything that involves movement, riding a bicycle, or you those psychomotor functions as a form of cognition are important, but we're talking about value judgments. We're talking about knowing what you should do when you're designing a sign up flow, or a cookie consent notice, or a something in the feed of information if your digital product had social functions. So yeah, that takes time. It takes time for people to be able to identify um, whether there would be an issue.
Right.
So what
So
types of tools do we use, like to
yeah,
to help people?
time and practice to allow for behavior change, because I was listening to you, and of course I agree, you should involve more stakeholders, have discussions, but we know the reality of a lot of companies that we work for, and our own companies, is that often you are under time and budget constraints, and you feel like you cannot afford to waste time, in quotes, right, on these little things, and it's just a distraction. So it comes back to having this culture change, and changing behavior and practicing every day, like you said, to train the muscle memory. So when you're faced with a situation, you automatically start thinking about possible implications, because it's probably, it's easy for us to kind of criticize the small decisions that were made at a certain point in time at certain companies, but those decisions happen within a certain context, and the context basically has to change in order to support people in making the better decisions. So it
Mm,
comes to allowing that space for employees to be able to practice what we're discussing, right? So just as companies, especially big tech companies, are investing in wellness programs and even paying for mindfulness training, right? Why don't they instead invest and support and give employees time to have this ethical practice, as we like to call it, right?
mm. That's a great point on, and if you're in one of these roles and you're responsible for leading the operationalization of ethical decision making in your organization, what you just said, giving time, and we see this quite a lot. Like you said, the constraints, the everyday stresses that you have when you're trying to, design and deploy new features, and if you're using agile and you've got sprints and there's pressure and things like that, that we fall back to defaults, and we forget to move slow. There's times where we need to move slow, and I think, like, if you're have the responsibility for the rollout of these initiatives, actually giving people time, just like you said, like giving people time to, like, meditate, take care of their wellness, and I think having the time as a individual within a team, be that in marketing or compliance or policy or design, product engineering, data science, um, you do need time. You need time for the training, but you also need time for considered discussion,
For
debate,
practice, yeah.
and
So
and and
that
that
it's not
practice.
seen as wasting time, right, when you're having the discussion, and it's not seen as falling behind on a roadmap. Um, but it's productive time when you have these discussions, when you go out of your office, when you talk to different people. Yeah, it's important work, and I don't think it's being recognized. It's something
Mm,
that I think a lot of companies see as a nice to have, but when the deadlines hit and all of that, that is probably one of the first things that gets removed, and we say, oh, we'll deal with that later, right? At some point. Um, and it's the same
yeah,
with how we get into technical debt as well, because we know often we have to make these compromises because we are pushing ourselves, to release faster, to uh, provide value to our customers and all of that. But when we look at the big picture, providing value means also respecting our customers as human beings, being more inclusive, reaching more people because we stop and really think things through, right? um so yeah.
yeah. That idea of seeing it as part of the process, and that, this is, something that, myself, as a, having product roles a lot in the past, that, like a user story, for instance, was this, it's like the start of a conversation,
Yeah.
and I think both of us who've done this work, and have various approaches to how you can embed these types of stories. And you worked at PledgeWorks is a really good example of that, like the pledges that a team can make around their intention, how they're actually going to deal with privacy, user data,
Yeah.
inclusivity, things like that, and having it present, right? Because I think one of the important things that I came across in a lot of the work that I've done over the past several years is that you have to embed this in the existing context. Like,
Yeah.
what are the tools? What are the interfaces? What are the ways of working that people already have? And if you can embed prompts, uh, ways that help remind people of what they need to be doing or factoring in, you're much more likely to see this behavior change take place, versus a set of principles. Like, that's just not enough. I mean, when it gets down to operationalizing things, and changing the everyday behaviors, and embedding these types of decisions in everyday workflows of people, you need a clear focus on that behavior change, and actually employing some behavioral design techniques, as a result of that, can be really fruitful. Thinking about the type, what context people are motivated, and I refer to, like, BJ Fogg's model with motivation and ability, as the two axes, and the prompts, and people aren't always motivated to be factoring in the potential downside consequences of, like, a product feature decision, um, or they might not have the time, so their ability is diminished. So how you prompt them, and factoring in the the behavioral context into like the rollout of any program becomes really important. Um, and maybe sometimes, I think, what we're doing with Tethix is really about enabling people to train this ethical muscle memory, this moral imagination in lower stakes games, um, where they can work through these types of decisions, and treat things as a team sport rather than an individual sport, because you don't make these decisions in a silo. You cannot be the sole arbiter of value judgments, as we started the conversation with. I think is a really important part of um, doing this. So, again, like training programs, you have training programs for privacy, and there's a lot of compliance that drives that. We have GDPR and CCPA, and here in Australia, we've got a lot of focus with another review of the privacy principles, Australian privacy principles, taking place. But they're relatively mature areas. Versus ethics in emerging technologies or ethics in kind of digital product development is relatively new. So how does the this idea of training in lower stakes kind of games play out? Like, why is that important? Like, to do it when the risks are a little bit lower.
Yeah, I think, when you were talking, it reminded me, it seems like we're at this very early point when we realize ethics and responsibility is important because, we have these products that, like we said earlier, have this massive scale and so many unforeseen consequences and implications. And it feels like we're at a point where we decided, okay, we want to start doing this ethics thing, and we bought all the equipment, like the sneakers, new equipment. We hired a coach, but now we're all kind of, okay, how do we start training, right? And it's intimidating. And when you're learning a new sport, a new skill, you don't immediately start, by signing up for the Olympics and participating in the Olympics. You start training small, right, at your local field, with maybe just a couple of friends, see how it goes, and we've now got the sneakers, our t-shirts that says responsibility. We want to be a better company, and it is hard, right? So, and the first steps, and we all know from our lives when we try to pick up a new habit, the first step is always the hardest one. And of course, you don't go out there, like, let's say if you want to become a better public speaker, you start training on your own. You present in front of people you trust, so they can give you honest feedback and help you improve, right? You don't immediately go on a big stage. And that's why it is important to have these safe spaces, be able to start practicing with the people you trust, where you can have the difficult conversations. And like we said earlier, right, we don't exactly know what it means to be ethical, and we still have to figure out these things. So I think that is why it's also important to have this, like, little training grounds that we're trying to build at Tethix as well. So you can do it with people you can trust, where you feel comfortable talking about certain things. You're not worried about failing big under public scrutiny, right? Because we all know that can be pretty harsh. So yeah, just start training at your local field with your friends, right? That is, I think, the first step that we have to start making. And it's not necessarily about the tools. It's more about showing up every day, practicing every day, and learning through the process. And eventually, of course, hopefully you reach the Olympics of responsibility, right? And become really good at it. But yeah, I think a lot of people are afraid just of that. How do you start? Right? And afraid of failure and being judged, especially from the outside. So that, in my opinion, is the tricky part.
Yeah, that's a great, analogy as well. Like, when you're starting off in a new sport or a new activity, and probably don't have to use a lot of sports analogies, but the you when you know, joining a basketball team and you want to get into basketball, you know, you go to a court and you might find, you know, more casual ways to practice where it's like, okay, you make a mistake or you miss a shot or whatever, that you know, it's like, okay, I lost the game, big deal, you know, learn from it. You know, if you got people that, you know, are maybe more experienced in playing the game, they can, you know, coach you and give you guidance and support. And I think this idea of um, being able to play it out before you live it out, like with ethical decision making, is important. And the risks, you know, and the anxieties that come from making some of these decisions. And you know, I use this tool in some of the work that I've done in the past, which I think I've showed you. We've kind of explored the switching canvas, and you know, this is looking at switching behaviors from old behaviors to new behaviors. And one of the important factors is like people's fears and anxieties. And in the work that I did, and you know, a whole bunch of research with over 120, 30 stakeholders, was you know, one of the big anxieties is just getting it wrong.
Yeah.
You know, and if you're afraid and you have so much anxiety around making the decisions, you know, and you have high stakes, like you know, you could lose your job, or if the decision relies on you as a product manager or someone that signs off on something, you know, this next feature, oh crap, my my bonus is tied to like the release of
Yeah.
this feature. And you know, you've got KPIs and you've got all these things that do affect, they really affect people's cognitive function. They affect people's ability to actually make decisions with clarity.
Yeah.
And you can't train moral imagination in that context. There's too much stake at play. um, you know, it's just like you know, when you go to the court, you know, to train, you're not going to go and join and be part of the NBA, right? Come and, you know, go and train at your local court. You know, play a game that is and train in lower stakes situations, to develop that kind of ethical muscle memory and moral imagination. Um,
And that is why we also like to draw inspiration from video games, right? Where it's
mm,
part of the process to fail, and you know you'll probably have to die a couple of times before you are able to win the game, right? And it's part of the process. And I think it's, you know, also from my experience trying to teach adults how to program, there's this, you know, as adults we are, you know, used to trying to uphold this perfect image of adults, and you know, being perfect, and you know, trying to, you know, wanting to be perfect at everything we do on the first try, and we're so afraid of failure. So this kind of mental model and environment of games where they tell you, you know, it's no big deal, so you're gonna die, lose a life, you can start again. And you know, in mindfulness practice, it's also an important concept. You know, you try, and they tell you, you know, you're not going to be perfect, you're going to lose focus, but the important thing is to keep trying, right? But people, like you said, they have to feel safe and comfortable with that, right? And
mm,
if you know, yeah, you're going to lose your bonus, or your team members are going to look at you the wrong way if you fail, right? That you're not able really to learn and evolve and grow in your practice. So it's super important to have that, the right
mm.
environment. um, and you know, the roles of chief ethic technologists, or whatever they are called, you know, it's part of it is probably also creating the safer environment for everyone at the company, to be able to have these conversations, to be able to practice all of these things in a safe way, and make it part of the daily work, and push for that change.
Yeah, that's a good point to be raising here. Like, you know, we hear a lot of this, and there's way more talk recently talking about psychological safety and creating like a safe space for people to be able to raise issues, The work that I've done was one of the key points around people need to feel safe, comfortable, and in a trusting environment where they can say, "Hey, I don't think we should do that," or I think there's an issue with that. We need to kind of stop and have a discussion. And if you don't have that safe environment, you're going to miss all these issues. You're going to miss things that are can end up in features and deployed to market and be impacting end users. And you want to avoid that as best as possible. And even sometimes, even when there's psychological safety, enabling people to be able to raise issues anonymously. If you're in the process of operationalizing ethics within your product development, digital ethics, data ethics, AI ethics. There's lots of different permutations and words, different areas of ethical decision making within technology that we're talking about here. But this idea of being able to have an easy way for people to kind of raise issues, isolate it. If they've identified something, they need to be able to have a channel to bring it up and have that escalated in some way, surfaced through some process. The importance of psychological safety and those safe environments. And sometimes people need, an interesting part that's different to, the examples that we started with information, infosec, cybersec, kind of opsec, privacy, security engineering, is that, ethics is about more, value, a lot of value judgments. And we might have defined values as part of our organization. We might have defined principles and, we're reasonably mature and we've worked through that process. And there's not a lot of organizations that are even got to having defined principles yet, let alone operationalizing. But this idea that you need to provide a way for people to adapt and train in these ways and develop these skills, these essential skills. Like if you're a technology company, you're developing technology, be that biotech, agri-tech, digital technology, you need to provide a context for people to be able to identify and raise, escalate issues and actually know that those issues are going to go through, be escalated, and be resolved.
Yeah.
If you can't,
I think this is a really important piece of the puzzle. Actually, acting on your intentions and the issues that you identify, because I see a lot of examples where companies, have maybe these discussions and are inviting people to speak up, but when people do speak up, their concerns are, they're acknowledged and say, you bring up an important point, they're being thanked, but, nothing really changes. You still have to release the feature that you brought issues about the next day even, right? So when that happens repeatedly, most people are not going to speak up anymore because they see their concerns are not being addressed and the company is not taking them seriously. And I think that will be a challenge for a lot of existing companies where probably employees have brought up issues in the past and they have not been actually taken seriously. So, for existing companies, I think a lot of the challenge will be also how to regain employee trust. And in that case, I suppose, hiring somebody for that role that is responsible and will put certain changes in place might be beneficial as a signal. But as we said before, you need to also have a kind of cultural and process change to go with that. So it's not just ethics washing, in essence, as we see with greenwashing. And we are recording this in June. We see lots of examples of pride washing this month, and everyone is celebrating queerness this month, but it will be forgotten soon afterwards. And I think employees see that, and can see when something is just a marketing campaign, and some fancy thing that you put maybe in your responsibility report at the end of the year just to say you've done something. But when it's not really authentic, and it's not really lived and followed through every day.
Yeah, that's a like where Tethix like started with a focus on greater than learning when we first kind of launched, with the seed, and a big focus, of ours was like on this ethical intent to action gap. It's like, yeah, we've got this intent, and sometimes it's genuine, and a lot of the times it is. It's like genuine, um, but being able to have that translate to behavior is the key thing here. And I think, when it comes to like the disingenuous intent, um, where there's statements put out, or there's uh, public facing communications made around like, pride, and, oh, we'll change our social media avatars and have rainbows. But when employees see that it's not actually happening, that detrimentally impacts the fabric that binds the organization, which is trust in leadership, trust in people, trust in the competency to deliver on what is said. And I think there was some research that was done by through MIT and in collaboration with an organization called Culture X, and they looked at Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, and their public statements, around what they value. Talk to employees, and surveyed employees, and they found no correlation between what was said and what was done.
Yeah.
And this is people probably, listening, you might go, yeah, see that everywhere. Hopefully it's not our organization that's actually, doing the same thing. But it's not that there's, again, reinforcing that it's not that there's, there's no genuine intent there. It's just sometimes this is hard. Like like value statements are hard to translate to action.
Yeah.
Because it is about culture. It's about the ways of being, ways of doing, ways of perceiving, ways of relating, ways of designing and building, your organization, your products, your services, and the everyday behaviors. And that takes time, which is where I think, like this idea of, purpose, values, principles, and then things like pledges, where they're much more action orientated, and they're about their everyday behaviors, and being able to see things through to resolution and be prompted about it in your everyday workflows becomes this constant reminder of like the behavior change that is relevant. And I think that there's a interesting part of this is the lifetime of these types of roles, and this is an immature field. It's only just emerging. We're only really seeing now these roles kind of coming out. But once it becomes, part of everyday behaviors, you no longer need these dedicated functions. Like Salesforce has the Office for Ethical and Humane Use within their organization, and they're a massive organization. Growth by acquisition. And they bought Slack several months ago. And they've got a reasonably decent team. They're one of the most mature organizations in this field. But in 5-7 years, ideally that function dissolves because it's become part of everyday behaviors. It's embedded in the way that people their ways of working, and that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources.
So the goal
Salesforce
for
has the budget, right?
for a chief ethics officer would be to make their role obsolete in 5 to 10 years, right? So if you do your job
Yeah.
right, you become basically unnecessary because the entire company adopts this kind of behavior. Um, and
Yeah.
we could wish similar for a lot of roles, from sustainability, inclusivity, and all of that. That we wouldn't need them because they just become the way we do business, the way we do whatever we're it is that we are doing, right?
Becomes part of the acronym BAU, business as usual.
Yeah, the new default.
Yeah, the new default, the default mode, the default network of culture within an organization. Um, yeah, make yourself redundant
Yeah.
if you're in that role, and that takes a lot of time.
Yeah,
I think
surely.
being patient with these efforts, that real paradigm shifts in thinking are very rare within an organization. Smaller organizations like a startup that's a little bit more agile and can move quick and adapt quick, 5 to 9 kind of employee scale, they can go through a paradigm shift as a result of like new ways of thinking being introduced and discussion, so the cultural change, across that network of 5 to 9 people, like that can happen relatively quick. Whereas if you got an employee count, a head count of, like 15,000, 20,000 people, takes a long time for that to permeate through, and you won't see paradigm shifts. You'll see incremental change, and I think patience in that transformation, that metamorphosis becomes part and parcel of doing the work.
Yeah, so we need to be patient. Although at the same time, I'm thinking, right, it's going to take a lot of time for existing companies. But like you said, now there's an opportunity for people to experiment with new ways of doing business, and challenging the existing narratives, and we I think both have a bit of a revolutionary streak in ourselves as well. And hopefully new ideas, and we can imagine new ways of doing business where you actually wouldn't at any point require these roles, because the whole organization, in whatever shape and form it takes place, is designed in a way around ethics and responsibility, right? So but yeah, that's probably a bigger topic for one of our
and,
next episodes, but
and another episode.
yeah.
Yeah, it's ethical by default, right? It's like,
Yeah,
I think if an organization is, it's like in privacy, privacy enabling technologies, privacy enhancing technologies, um, privacy by design, now much more considered privacy and security by design, because you need security to have privacy, but you can have security and not privacy. Um, you see organizations that are building technology from the ground up, using these principles, using these
yeah,
approaches. And I think we will see, and we are seeing more organizations, startups, social ventures, social enterprises, coming and emerging and coming to market with products that have these ways just part of their modus operandi. This is what they stand for. This is what they believe, and I think we're going to see more of that over the next several years. And maybe that is a good a good kind of starting point for some discussion in the next episode. Is ethical by default, ethical by design.
yeah.
If you start with that what does that look like? And maybe we can kind of explore some
Yeah, for sure.
examples.
Yeah, and we would also love to hear from you, right? Or hopefully we have some listeners
People
or
watching this.
watchers. Yeah, hopefully. So if you have any ideas, do let us know in the comments, or even if you have ideas for topics we could explore in future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Because right now this is just Matt and myself, talking out loud as we often do. But we do hope this will become a part of a bigger discussion. So it's not just our two floating heads here in this paper world. So
Yes, we will be introducing people into this paper world at some point with some guest speakers
yes,
to bring some more dynamism to the Talking Tethix show. But absolutely, if you've got any comments, ideas, please share them with us. If you've got any examples of organizations that you think we should kind of showcase as in the next episode to talk about, please by all means share them. We'd love to check them out ourselves and promote organizations doing good work, trying to build better tech futures. That's what we're all about.
yes, absolutely. All right, I think this feels like a good wrap-up point for our first discussion. So I think we covered a lot. We talked about the role and the goal of chief tech ethicists to make themselves redundant, hopefully, in the next 5 to 10 years. But we also talked, about the kind of big responsibilities they will have in creating this larger cultural change within companies, because it is not just about hiring somebody and putting out statements and explaining how you're responsible. It's about starting doing the practice and the hard work every day.